Hillsborough.
Good evening. At this time last Friday, thousands of Liverpool fans were preparing to travel to Sheffield to see their team play the FA Cup semi-final at Hillsborough. It was supposed to be a showpiece occasion, but it ended in disaster. We've all seen the pictures, we all know what happened, though the reasons why are by no means certain. Sadly, tragedy is nothing new to both sides of the Pennines. The Bradford City fire, the Manchester airport disaster, Heysel and now Hillsborough. In the face of such appalling tragedy, people have again been united in grief. The mental and physical scars will of course take a long time to heal, but there is one certainty: everyone is determined to make sure such a tragedy never happens again. So what does the future hold after Hillsborough?
Later in the programme I'll be discussing what that future might be with a panel of guests. They come from both sides of the Pennines, from Sheffield and Liverpool, the cities deeply affected by the disaster. From another city offering help born out of a similar experience. From the world of football, the fans who love the game. Those who play it. Those responsible for crowd safety. Those who also want to build a safer future with other sports. And those who understand why fans behave as they do. There'll also be an opportunity for you to have your say. You'll be able to take part in a phone-in programme about Hillsborough on your BBC local radio station. We'll be giving you the numbers to call at the end of our discussion here in the studio.
For the past week, all our thoughts have been dominated by Hillsborough. The government has launched an inquiry into what happened last Saturday, but away from the controversial issue of who was to blame, attention has naturally focused on the cities of Liverpool and Sheffield. Nearly a week after Hillsborough, the sense of shock and grief in those two communities is still overwhelming.
As the enormity of the tragedy which had struck Liverpool began to dawn on a still Sunday morning, there was only one place to turn. Just as those who died were bound by their love of Liverpool Football Club, so the bereaved, bemused and bewildered people of Merseyside now found new strength in the shadow of the world-famous Kop. Initially, it could only be a time for grieving. No one sought justification for the horrific events, only solace and understanding. It was that will to comprehend why this tough community had once again been singled out for suffering that led thousands of Liverpudlians to another of the city's landmarks, just 24 hours after the carnage of Hillsborough.
Tonight, we come here to pray. We come to mourn, to offer sympathy, and to prepare ourselves as a city to help and care for the bereaved and the injured. To be, as it were, a civic family.
They say if Liverpool's heart is with football, its soul belongs to the church. And perhaps it was inevitable that the two images should become intrinsically entwined. The pilgrimage to Anfield has continued all week. Thousands of people have now left their own mark of respect to the dead. Some are deeply personal, others speaking for a community united in loss. Together they've turned the home of their footballing heroes into a fitting shrine. A memorial that may give strength to the families and friends that must bury their dead during the coming days.
All of us feel utter devastation. The whole city and the city of Liverpool, all who love football, all are involved, Not for the first time, a sunny afternoon, with the exciting prospect of a close match, has suddenly been transformed into carnage.
When the enormity of the tragedy is as great as at Hillsborough, the church tries to express in word and hymn the feelings of the people. In Liverpool this week and here in Sheffield, the hymn was the same in both grieving cities. For the survivors at the Sheffield hospitals, there were visits from relatives, friends and the royal family, from the Lord Mayor of Sheffield and from the Liverpool team. For those who had died, the tributes came from all over the world. By today, 7,000 had signed the remembrance book at the town hall. They had donated thousands of pounds to the disaster appeal. All week, the greatest outpouring of grief has been at the scene of the tragedy, the Hillsborough ground itself.
I'm not coming back. That's it. Finished. No way. That's my final. The flowers are finished. I'm never going back.
Many relatives and friends have made the pilgrimage from Merseyside. Here, the people of Sheffield and Liverpool have been together, joined in mourning.
Reports from Jake Fowler in Sheffield and Juliet Bremner in Liverpool. Another community which has experienced tragedy in recent years is Bradford, my hometown. The fire at the Bradford City football ground in 1985 claimed the lives of 56 people. Following that disaster, survivors and the relatives of those who died had to face up to life without their loved ones. This week, some of them have been to Liverpool and Sheffield. Other people who became involved in helping the victims of Bradford have also been comforting those affected by Hillsborough. They've been able to pass on some of the lessons learned during the past 4 years. Peter Pitt reports.
The tributes this week at Hillsborough formed an image powerfully reminiscent for the people of Bradford. A reminder of their football fans who died in the fire at Valley Parade. The message from Bradford to the people of Sheffield and Merseyside is that the traumas still continue. A year after the fire, at the unveiling of a memorial, many of the survivors had barely begun to come to terms with their grief. Now, 4 years on, they're still travelling the long road to full recovery. Duncan Firth's wife died from burns suffered in the Bradford fire.
And we actually had phone calls here at the Link Centre.
Pat Cummings coordinated a counselling team for the bereaved. She is still counselling survivors who cannot yet cope alone.
Very, very distressed.
The grieving didn't start until I got out. You just can't grieve when you're in the hospital. I mean, my wife died there in the hospital, but it didn't hit me completely until I got back to my own home, and then things started hitting you as to why, that she wouldn't be coming up this road anymore, and she wouldn't be doing the things we did before anymore, and things like that. They hit you really then.
What advice would you have to people facing the beginning of that long route?
Well, I think eventually you've got to talk about it. You've got to get it off your chest, and you've got to come to terms with it. I don't think you'll ever get over it. If you've lost someone, you'll never get over that loss. But at least you can come to terms with the fact that you were in this tragedy.
I'm still involved in running a small group of people who were bereaved at the fire, and I'm also still involved in some one-to-one counselling.
What kind of impression do you think that gives of the kind of long-term nature of the responsibility and the task facing social services in Sheffield and in Liverpool, and even perhaps in Nottingham?
I think it's about the time scale of these things, and I think it's also about the different types of problems, because somebody who is bereaved, for instance, we learnt in Bradford, isn't really wanting to become part of a group for at least a year after being bereaved. And we also found that the need for them is for quite a number of years to meet as that group.
What words might you have for the police, for ground staff, ambulance people who were in Sheffield, and for relatives and those who were actually in the ground in Liverpool? What information might you want to give them?
I think for the people who are helping, like the police and the ground staff, the ambulance, one of the things we learnt in Bradford was that they are very, very severely affected, and this shouldn't be underestimated. And the police, the firemen, it's rather a macho profession where people are expected to cope, but we learnt very much that they need help too.
Gathered together just after the Hillsborough disaster, many of the police officers who'd been on duty couldn't cope alone with the full enormity of what had happened.
Some were already, obviously, in deep shock and very deeply distressed. I mean, I had two crying in my arms. And then I had others who I could see were in need of help.
The answer was to call in a psychologist, Dr. Douglas Duckworth, who had gained experience following the Bradford fire. He's seeing as many as 200 of the officers at Hillsborough.
Dr. Duckworth was called in by the West Yorkshire Police some short time after the Bradford fire disaster, and he took over with that and gained a great deal of experience in dealing with police officers in these circumstances. And he's bringing that expertise to us now.
Many of those who still support Bradford at the Valley Parade Ground were there on the day of the fire 4 years ago. Despite the horror of that experience, they've continued to come.
After the initial shock has worn off, people are in a state of great, overwhelming feelings.
Social worker Michael Stewart helped the survivors of Bradford to cope. Now an independent counsellor, he's been brought in by Merseyside Health Authority. He's preparing them for the task of offering support to 1,000 people who've rung asking for help.
And I remember one Bradford survivor who said, if there is a devil, his fist came up out of the air. A violent, horrible, demonic experience. This is a terrible repeat of the Bradford fire in terms of its destruction. But however, from working in Bradford and all the other disasters which we have worked in, we now know what sorts of problems people are likely to have, and therefore what kinds of services and resources we need to provide for them.
There is another area where the experience of Bradford is coming to the aid of those afflicted after Hillsborough.
Bradford Disaster Appeal, can I help you?
The Bradford appeal raised millions. Roger Suddards, its chairman, was praised at the highest level for the speed with which he met the needs of the bereaved. This week, by coincidence, he was speaking at a conference on disaster planning. It had been arranged 9 months ago, and he's already helping the Hillsborough fundraisers.
It's appalling, it horrified me, and I felt that really in a way we were back almost to Bradford when I went last night with David Horrocks, our trust fund manager, and we went to help the Liverpool people who are setting up this joint fund for the people who were bereaved and injured in the terrible disaster at the weekend.
This Bradford memorial commemorates the 56 who died in the fire. Out of that disaster has come perhaps a small consolation this week. The knowledge that painful experience gained then is helping heal the fresh wounds of Hillsborough.
The public has already responded to Hillsborough as it did to Bradford. The Hillsborough Disaster Appeal was officially launched today, but already more than £1 million has been raised for the victims and their families, with donations coming in all the time. If you want to contribute to the fund, then we'll be reminding you of the address at the end of the programme. The 95 people who died at Hillsborough loved football and the team they supported. Liverpool are expected to decide early next week whether to play their FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest. The game is scheduled to take place at Old Trafford, Manchester on May the 7th. But whatever Liverpool decide, football will continue to be played and watched by millions. Whether it'll ever be the same again is open to question. Hillsborough, though, has raised a lot of questions about the country's football stadia and the conditions in which people watch matches.
Football's terraces haven't always been dangerous places. This is the Liverpool Cop in 1964, when the passion of the crowd was an endearing phenomenon which acquired cult status.
But the comradeship on the Cop then, as it is now, is still great. You know, everybody is friends on the Cop, always has been, and always will be as far as I'm concerned. Even with the derby matches, you know, we had the derby matches, same thing applied there. There was never any animosity on the Cop.
Many young people's lives began to centre around the weekend visit to the football match with a group of like-minded friends of the same age, wearing the same clothes, very much associating with their city, their town, their region. And it was an enjoyable, exciting thing to do, which in the initial stages anyway didn't regularly turn to violent behaviour.
Today, the football terraces like these at Old Trafford, the home of Manchester United, are different in appearance at least. The fences have gone up, the pens are smaller, the crush barriers are stronger, and capacities have been reduced. But ordinary, decent people still go by choice to stand at football matches, and they say that not everything has changed.
It's still there. Still, a lot of it is still there, mostly on these grounds here, without a shadow of a doubt. Without these two grounds here, there's still a lot of comradeship, togetherness, which proves it in this issue now, doesn't it?
It's just basically being involved in what's going on. When you're sitting in a stand, you're sort of on your own, even though the stand could be packed. You have no contact whatsoever with whoever's next to you, but in the ground, getting jostled about, that's part and parcel of football.
The trouble with the terrace is, when something goes wrong, the consequences are magnified. Burnden Park, Bolton in 1946. Spectators without tickets climbed walls to get into a cup tie. A gate was opened to let people escape, only for thousands more to swarm in from outside. 33 people died in the crush. Ibrox Park, Glasgow in 1971, the tragedy that put the terraces under government scrutiny. 66 people died on an exit stairway. Safety was now a priority. The Green Code of 1973 proffered advice. The Safety of Sports Ground Act added the force of law. But the authorities were also concerned about trouble caused by design as well as accident. Pitch invasions and crowd confrontations clearly had to be avoided. The fences began to go up. Somehow the cheery 60s had led to something much, much worse.
The increased press coverage gave a lot of publicity to the fact that incidents do occur at football grounds, on football terraces, and that there is some fighting. So young people who gain excitement out of having a fight decided this was the place to go.
The Bradford City fire forced attention back to the question of safety. The Popplewell report issued a series of new guidelines, but even these fell short of an outright call to do away with the fences, which summed up English football's safety dilemma.
The extent to which Europe differs from England is exaggerated. People talk of as if all European stadia are all-seater. In fact, all-seater stadia, as Simon Inglis has pointed out, are quite rare in Europe. There is frequently a residual terrace area, even though it's on by and large smaller terrace area than here. Also, there is a long history of crowd troubles in Europe, dating as long as the game itself. One advantage that European stadia do have, I think, over English grounds is that they by and large are newer. They are less old.
If overseas experience is mixed, can football learn from other sports? Rugby league also attracts big crowds to ageing terraces, but somehow the atmosphere has never turned sour.
There's a sense of discipline and accepted discipline on the field, and I think that reaches the terraces. So that when we, as the administrators, talk to our supporters and talk to them as our family, I think they respond.
It's unlikely now that life on the terraces will ever be the same. The irony for football is that catastrophe came at the very time that the spirit of fun was returning to our soccer grounds, and supporters were brandishing nothing more lethal than thousands of inflatable toys.
Well, to discuss some of the issues raised in that report, I'm joined now by David Oxley, Chief Executive of the Rugby League, who's in our Leeds studio. Mr. Oxley, how safe are Rugby League grounds, would you say?
First, Harry, could I just publicly express on behalf of everybody in Rugby League our deep sympathy and offer our prayers to the cities of Liverpool and Sheffield and, of course, the game of soccer. To answer your question, we've been asking ourselves all week, could it happen to us? And we are not complacent. It's clear that with the increasing crowds available to Rugby League, we're as probably vulnerable as any other sport in the organisation, the management and the control of large crowds. And with increasingly large crowds available to our game, it's something that we as a governing body must master. We haven't had to put fences up yet. We rely on the goodwill and the good sense, the discipline and self-control of our fans, and we work hard to nurture that with the fans, but we know we cannot take it for granted. And there will be lessons for us in Justice Taylor's report, just as there is for all major spectator sports.
I know York, for example, are considering the possibility of moving their ground outside the city. Is that a trend that perhaps you might encourage in Rugby League?
Yes, it's a fact, in fact, that, Harry. As you know, Wigginton Road, sadly, you and I spent time there, is no more, and York will move to a custom-built stadium. It's a joint venture between the club, with the profits on the sale of the land at Wigginton Road, and the Rydale Council. A fine new stadium, custom-built with all modern designs. It'll be very comfortable. It'll certainly be as safe as it possibly can, but essentially it will be a running track, a running stadium, an athletics track with a rugby pitch in the middle. It therefore may initially alienate a few fans who are used to tight-knit grounds and the atmosphere that that creates, the closeness to the action. But of course the advantages must outweigh the disadvantages, and the safety factors particularly so.
David, thank you, but stay with us. We'll be joining you later on in our discussion. Well, if I can turn to Europe now, and joining us from Paris is the BBC correspondent there, Edward Sturton. Edward, what is the European attitude towards Great Britain at the moment when they see all these disasters?
Well, I think you followed, I'm sure, the row caused by the president of UEFA when he talked about savagery in the crowd. I think he reflects a fairly general view. It's not that events have been misunderstood, and indeed there's a great deal of sympathy here for what happened. There'll be a minute's silence at all French football matches tomorrow out of respect for the dead. But I think for many people it confirmed what they see as the problems of English football in particular, and indeed of England in general. One newspaper earlier this week linked the tragedy not just with the Heysel tragedy, but also with the King's Cross crash, rather the Clapham Junction crash, the King's Cross fire, and indeed the Free Enterprise disaster.
There seems to be a trend in Europe that local authorities or local communities, local towns, cities, actually run the stadia. Now, is that something which seems to be successful in Europe?
Well, there's an example of this in Turin, where there are two teams in the town, and there's the sort of rivalry that you sometimes get when there are two teams in a town or city, and yet the teams use a stadium owned by the local government on alternate weekends, and they seem quite happy with that. It doesn't seem to produce any problem.
And yet there's an awful lot of policing in observation there, because I understand there were nearly 4,000 police at the AC Milan-Real Madrid game in midweek. Would we accept over in this country that level of policing?
Well, it certainly seems to have been quite effective at that particular match. It wasn't just police, there were also helicopters flying over the ground almost throughout the match, and body searches of almost every one of the 80,000 spectators. And whether it's the right way to go, I can't judge. It certainly seems to have stopped trouble at what was potentially quite a highly charged game.
Mr. Sturton, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, after Hillsborough, government legislation will inevitably follow as it did after the Bradford City fire. Mr. Justice Popperwell's report after Bradford led to major changes at sports grounds in this country. He called for suitable and adequate exits in all sports grounds. Stewards should be trained in how to help the police during evacuation. An adequate first aid room should be provided. A more suitable police radio be produced. Football clubs should review arrangements for entry and organisation of turnstiles, and consideration be given to the design of an effective perimeter fence with proper exits. All of those questions will again be considered by the inquiry into what happened at Hillsborough. It's being led by Lord Justice Taylor, who's been in Liverpool today talking to club officials and fans who were at the match. He's hoping to have an interim report ready for the start of the next football season. Already, though, the fences have started coming down, and Liverpool have said that Anfield is to be turned into an all-seater stadium. Whatever legislation follows, the organisers of 2 future international sporting events in the north of England are already planning for the 1990s and beyond. The 1991 World Student Games are being held in Sheffield and Manchester is planning to stage the 1996 Olympic Games in the northwest. Both events are determined to build on the lessons of the past and give spectators what they believe is a safer future.
It may take many years for Sheffield to overcome the shock of the Hillsborough disaster, but building projects like this one just a few miles away should help restore the city's sporting image. After earmarking the site of an old steelworks 12 months ago, work is progressing with remarkable speed to create an Olympic standard athletic stadium. It'll be one of 10 venues, including Hillsborough itself, to host the 1991 World Student Games, destined to be the biggest sporting and cultural event seen in Britain. 6,000 competitors will take part, watched by 200,000 spectators, who will enjoy world-class facilities built to the very latest crowd safety guidelines. Design work is still going on to incorporate the recommendations of the Popplewell report, so that spectator access, gangways and even the roofing material more than meet stringent safety standards.
We're standing at the level where spectators will come into the grandstand, the main grandstand here. And you can see we're something like 4 metres above the actual track level. Now what that means is that spectators come in at the midpoint of the grandstand through a very large number of major entrances, more than are required by the Safety at Sports Ground Act. That means that by bringing them in at the middle, spectators are always that much closer to an exit than they might otherwise be. There are no terraces here because it's a different kind of event. There's no standing accommodation, so therefore there are no crush rails, there are no cages.
The designers have had the bonus of starting at the site from scratch and have included a canal system, rail links and a tram service to ease crowd congestion outside. It's hoped to finish the stadium in time for the athletic season of 1990 to take place, so that any teething troubles can be pinpointed. Sheffield earned the right to stage an event, only second in size to the Summer Olympics, because of its commitment to provide facilities which would regenerate its economy. And across the Pennines, Manchester too has an ambitious eye on its sporting future. The city is bidding to bring the 1996 Olympics to the northwest by making the Manchester Ship Canal an impressive centrepiece. Athens is clear favourite to host the Centenary Games, but with the decision not announced for 18 months, Manchester is already considering potential sites. Factors like security and access will be closely examined in the coming months.
There will be 3 inspection panels coming to Manchester and to the other candidates. There will be one from the International Federations to look at the technical aspects of the bid. There will be an inspection team from the National Olympic Committees to see how the athletes will be housed and transported and the general arrangements for the teams. And the IHC itself will send a group of people to assure themselves that the city or cities that are bidding are capable of handling the games.
On both sides of the Pennines, the planners are preparing to take on board even the preliminary findings of Lord Justice Taylor's report to help keep death away from the sporting stadiums of the future.
A glimpse of the future there, but what does the immediate future hold after Hillsborough?
Well, with me now to discuss that question and the issues raised in our reports are Rogan Taylor, the Football Supporters Association, who was at Hillsborough on Saturday. Gordon Taylor, Secretary of the Professional Footballers Association, he suggested that new regional stadia should be built. Jack Crawford, former Assistant Chief Constable of Merseyside Police, was in charge of policing all Liverpool and Everton games. He's now security consultant to the Football League. Roger Suddards is a Bradford lawyer who was chairman of the trustees of the Bradford Appeal. He's helped to set up a disaster prevention unit at Bradford University and is already involved with the Hillsborough Appeal. John Williams is a sociologist at Leicester University and co-director of the Centre for Football Research. He too was at Hillsborough and witnessed the disaster with Rogan Taylor. Bill Kenyon, the chairman of Wigan Athletic, who wants to build a super stadium and share it with Rugby League. Clive Betts, the leader of Sheffield City Council, has today been hearing the police account of what happened at Hillsborough, and Kiva Coombs of Liverpool City Council, their leader, who spent the week speaking for the city. Gentlemen, we won't be prurient and we won't be making any accusations, but we can't ignore feelings. Kiva Coombs, my impression is that the feeling in Liverpool is one of pained disbelief. Is that your impression? Is that how you would portray it?
It's pain and it's suffering. It's now coming to terms to an extent with the reality, and it's trying to comfort those who are going to suffer for a long time. So it's offering help against a background in which we are all, as a city, as a county, as an area, stunned and suffering very badly and very deeply.
Clive Betts, this tragedy was, in a sense, visited upon Sheffield. What's the feeling there?
I think stunned disbelief as well, feeling of great sympathy and sorrow for the people of Liverpool. I think really a feeling also of some collective responsibility, and because of that a desire to do all we can to help the bereaved and the injured.
Roger Suddards, you've heard what two community leaders, if you like, have said about the feelings in their cities. You remember Bradford. Do the things all tie in?
They do indeed. When I went to Liverpool on Monday evening, it was very reminiscent of Bradford, and you saw people silently filing past, putting their floral tributes. And it reminds you, as an ordinary member of the public, how difficult it is to express grief. How do you express it? By a floral tribute? By yourself giving money to funds, or what? It's very difficult for people to get grief out of their system.
Let's then look at one or two specifics and see if there is any help that we can discover. Behaviour and control at football matches. Rogan Taylor, what's happening? It's a dangerous tribal ritual, isn't it?
Well, I don't know that my analysis would be the same as that, but there are analogies, I think, with strong drink and football. Some people can take it better than others. A certain amount of training and accompanying people who are experienced helps. And it is a very, very powerful dramatic theatre. And the emotions which are released in that theatre are, of course, extremely intense.
John Williams, do you think that people behave differently at football matches, at big, exciting matches, more differently than they would ever behave anywhere else?
I think that's partly the case, certainly, but the game is still quite sectarian in its appeal, I think. I think it's struggling against its traditions, the facilities that it does have to offer, the kind of supporters it attracts, and it has become a focus for a very pronounced masculine form of rivalry at games. I think another point that needs to be made here, though, is that a lot of people now are pointing to football grounds and as if they've just discovered that grounds have fences, that grounds look rather embattled, and also as if these are very odd and don't fit into wider aspects of our culture. I mean, I'm bound to say that if you look at a lot of our public communal spaces these days, a lot of them look very decayed, a lot of them look very embattled, and I think we have to see football grounds in that context and not separate them out, as it were.
Jack Crawford, with a policeman's eye, as it was, do people behave significantly differently? Is there something wrong?
Yes, people do behave differently, obviously, in any crowd situation, because there's a greater feeling of safety when you're in numbers, of course, because you're out of the normal context of being on your own. I think the thing that impresses me most is that no matter how much expert knowledge you have in these things, the difficulty is always to equate control with safety in any situation, and that's the problem, that when you get a crowd together, acting in concert together, is that difficulty of trying to equate those two particular factions, you know, the safety of the crowd and the control of the crowd at the same time.
Bill Kenyon, with your experience at Wigan, is it easy to tell the difference between, say, a joyous crowd, a crowd who are enjoying things, and something that is a little bit dangerous and maybe a bit sinister?
Well, at Wigan, all I can say is it's always joyful. I mean, we don't have any problems at Wigan. But the thing is about it, we've got an old stadium, and I describe it as a bucket with holes in. And all we're doing is patching up the holes. What we really need is a new bucket or a new stadium.
That applies to Wigan. Does it also apply to a lot of other football clubs as well?
Oh, yes. I mean, Wigan is only one of 92 clubs, and I'm sure probably 50% of those are probably in the same position as Wigan are.
Gordon Taylor, do you think that we will learn some lessons about the behaviour of people, and we're not criticising necessarily the behaviour of people at football matches, learn some lessons that will stand us in good stead for the future?
We have to. I mean, my family remembers Bolton in '46. I remember, of course, the Munich being Mancunian. We've had Heysel, we've had Bradford, and you really despair that we will ever learn. And we need a quiet dignity. Football needs to come together and to have a total concentration of everybody's mind to make sure this just can't happen again. And I've been disturbed to find a government sort of oblivious to the fact that football is such an important fabric of the social life of this country that, you know, when football clubs look like even folding, there's such a tremendous feeling with people who never even go to the local club. We saw what happened at Bradford. You've seen what's happened this week. You know, football has almost been like a religion in Merseyside, that the government needs to acknowledge that. And we've got some of these stadiums, they say football, slum sport, slum stadiums, slum people. It's not that. They're a decent, genuine people. The game's been around 100 years. They've been caught out by modernisation and motor cars. There's no access. But what's interesting, the Italian government is putting £300 million to the Italian football for new stadium. The same in Spain. Our government takes over nearly £300 million and then says, oh, well, football clubs, they're private clubs. It's public entertainment, and we should be in a joint effort. And it's ridiculous we've only got Wembley. There should be at least 2 quality regional stadiums so that we don't have supporters going to matches who haven't got a ticket needing to get in.
Yeah, funding is something that we might well return to, but just very briefly, do you think, I mean, goodness knows it's been an awful long time, do you think that this awakening will now happen? Will it be there?
I hope and pray, out of respect for those 95 people who died at Hillsborough, many of them youngsters, we have an absolute duty to them, otherwise they will have died in vain.
We've clearly touched on the area of facilities already. Jack Crawford, we're living in the 19th century in soccer facilities, aren't we?
Yeah, we are, because as Bill said, you know, we're trying to patch up old buildings and keep it going, at the same time trying to keep up with modern trends. We're doing our best in real terms. We've had all the expert knowledge that we can gather together. I mean, nobody stood still after 1985. In actual fact, a tremendous amount of money has been spent on safety work on grounds, something like £50 million in total over the last 10 years, which is a tremendous amount of money. Some of it's been towards security, but a lot has been towards safety and improvements on the ground. But you can go on forever putting money into something that isn't built to do the job that you wanted to do today. So there's got to be a further investment on new grounds, possibly.
And yet, there has been a suggestion, Rogan Taylor, perhaps you could deal with this, there has been a suggestion that there is almost a cult of dereliction among football supporters, that they somehow revel in poor facilities.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that there is an element of truth in that football supporters perhaps also, like patches in the administration, are very conservative people, and there is almost a kind of reversed pride where standing in terrible conditions in terrible grounds is part and parcel of the experience which they are used to and which they associate with supporting football. But I don't think that's a major impediment to change, but it is certainly true that it's almost like an ordeal going to a football match.
If there is a cult of dereliction, if people somehow get some sort of pleasure out of it, is it because they've been deprived in the past?
Well, I mean, I think it's a kind of perverse turning something which is basically uncomfortable into something which gives one honour. I mean, John Williams and I actually approached that ground together on Saturday. We were in the stand, in the north stand, in £14 seats. We joined the crush inside the area approaching the turnstiles. And I think the first thing I said to John was, excuse me, who else but football supporters would be expected to pay 14 quid to fight to get to a turnstile, to get in before even the entertainment began? I said to him, it was like this outside of G Block at Wembley Stadium in 1986 at the Liverpool-Everton Cup final. I didn't like the sniff of it at all. I don't think John did either. So we're used to fairly tough times, even just getting in and out of grounds when we've paid for what most other people would think of as expensive seats.
David Oxley in Leeds, the treatment of spectators, the treatment of supporters. Wembley has been mentioned, of course, which, if anything, is our showpiece stadium, and yet even there, crowd control, marshalling, there's crushing. It's not ideal, is it?
No, indeed. We're very conscious that really, I know there's England and Albania, but our cup final a week tomorrow will probably be the first really major event, some 80,000 people attending, a capacity audience at Wembley after the disaster at Hillsborough. We had the control meeting only this Monday. This takes place before any major sporting event, of course. Everybody will be familiar. The elements responsible assemble, the management, the police, stewards and so on. And we're very conscious about bad incidents at our Wembley of last year. I think everybody had a bad time at Wembley last year because £50 million has been spent on bringing our only national stadium, as Gordon Taylor says, up to something like modern standards of comfort. And the work goes on as the events go on, and that causes enormous problems. We had some bad experiences at our Wembley last year, some very tight packing, people passing out and so on. So nobody can be complacent about these things, and particularly at major events in our only national stadium. We have to expand, and I agree entirely with Gordon, we need more stadia of this sort. But as we shall no doubt be discussing later, where is the funding coming from? At least these other countries, Europe, Australia, where I've been many times, North America, they receive massive tax incentives to invest in sports stadia. They directly or indirectly get massive investment from local and national government.
We'll come to funding in a moment, but Kiva Coombs, do you think that spectators will now be demanding, irresistibly, better facilities?
I think that's what they want, and I hope that's what they'll get it. And I'll tell you where the funding can come from. It can come from the government. That's where it should come from. And that the single thing the government should do first is to announce an investment in new stadium in the northwest. That's what Merseyside and the northwest deserve. And frankly, government could do it very easily, and that would be a real commitment. And that's what I'm looking forward to see.
All right. Well, you've led us very firmly into that area of funding. Clive Betts, the same view, presumably?
Oh, absolutely. I think the amount of money that comes out of the football pools and goes into central government coffers, as Gordon Taylor was saying, some of that at least ought to be put back into football. At the same time, local authorities could be doing a lot more if they were allowed to. Sheffield is building these facilities for the World Student Games, and we have two major problems. One, we had to get round all the restrictions that government puts on local authorities in investing in capital projects, and it took our lawyers and accountants literally months of work to find ways of actually doing that. And secondly, of course, we have major problems simply with the revenue costs. I think it ought to be recognised that sport, just like the arts, is entitled to subsidies on a proper basis, and football ought to be treated similarly. I do believe that the government has a view that somehow football is different. The people who go there are hooligans. They aren't people to be treated properly, and that is something that we've got to stand up and now counter very strongly in honour of those people who lost their lives on Saturday.
John Williams, if there were greatly improved facilities, if the money was forthcoming from wherever, would this change the attitude and the behaviour of people who attend football matches?
It's very hard to say that just changing the facilities at football matches would do that. I mean, I think that would symbolise much wider changes that we need to make and need to look at. I mean, people don't just suddenly come to a football match and misbehave and behave totally differently from what they do in other circumstances. There are connections there. And it really does mean looking at the lives of many young men away from football and why it is that they invest so much of themselves into football. I mean, I know from looking at Italian football that young Italians feel strongly about their football teams, but they have other things in their lives which are important too. And it's the extent to which these young men that we're interested in have other things that are important, I think, which is significant. I mean, these questions are really about how important we think sport is and how much we recognise the significance of sport in the lives of people in this country. Other governments in other countries recognise it's important. I don't see why we don't.
Bill Kenyon, as a football chairman, I mean, is the financing of football, not talking specifically about Wigan, is it arcane, is it archaic, has it got to change fundamentally?
Oh yes. I mean, at the time I've been at Wigan, which is 3.5 years, we've spent £500,000 on the ground, and we've been in discussions with the council now for approximately 6 months with a view to relocation for a multi-purpose sports stadium on what they call the Westwood Power Station site, which will be on a site where there are boating lakes, and also to incorporate hotels, and also the boxes in the stadium to be used as office accommodation.
Gordon Taylor, the management and the running of football, is it amateurish? Is it as bad as that? Is it a shambles?
No, it's not. There's a lot of people in the game who are full-time. There's a lot of people who are amateurs. I really felt quite encouraged before Saturday that attendances were up, players' behaviour was up, the behaviour on the terraces, we'd got, these plastic inflatable, the bananas, etc. Things well, there was a concentration, you know, that people were starting to pick up and think professionally about improving things. But as Bill said, and as the council leaders have said, sometimes we run up against brick walls, and a crisis like this, fingers have been pointed. And perhaps one of the problems within football, I have to be honest, is we've got the Players' Organisation, we've got the Football Association, we've got the Football League, then you've got local authorities, you've got police, you've got transport, you've got government. And it's very difficult to pull all those strings together.
That's exactly it,
effectively.
Isn't it? Even football can't get together, can it?
It's a big football match. Yes, it does get together. I mean, we have, you know, literally hundreds of games a season. There are thousands of teams. There are 40,000 teams registered. There are over 20 million fans coming through the turnstiles. But suddenly we have a disaster, and as Jack said, the potential for disaster is always there. But what I hope this can do is bring all those strings together much more effectively. And I hope Justice Taylor can recommend and really put into being the mechanics to do that effectively.
Right, I'll come to Jack Crawford in a moment, but Rogan Taylor first. I mean, Rogan Taylor, I mean, do you agree with what Gordon's just said? It's confusing with the two Taylors, but I mean, is that a valid point, you think, from a spectator, from a supporter's point of view?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, I know from conversations I've had with Gordon how he recognises that the one person not present at the family gathering of football is the spectator, is the supporter. That for 100 years, supporters have been viewed as just simply paying up and shutting up when it comes to making recommendations or being involved in decisions and so on. And unfortunately, you know, I hope that one of the things, though, that string pulling together which Gordon talks about, is in terms of bringing supporters on board. I think that that will become an unstoppable force as a result of Saturday, because anybody who knows anything about the game recognises that, you know, 500,000 regular attenders who are out there every Saturday is 500,000 pairs of eyes and ears. They know about the policing, they know about travelling to and from games, they know about the effective ticket allocations, they know what it's like on the motorway. In fact, they're experts. It's an enormous pool of expertise, you know, pulsing information, as it were, which could be available to the system, but where there is no structure to allow those pulses, if necessary, to run straight up the spine and into the executive box.
You're saying there's no strict structure in which that can be channelled in to the benefit of the game generally?
Well, I mean, you know, the Football Supporters Association has sought to set something up, but I mean, we're volunteers, we've got ourselves together right off the terraces. I mean, I would look to an organisation similar in some ways to the PFA for supporters, perhaps even drawing its funding in a similar way, so that it was independent but associated directly with the game, so that it could do things for supporters in the same way. I mean, the PFA runs educational programs for its people, it insures them, it takes care of them if they're injured, it gives them a chance to be involved in the game after their career's over and so on. You can imagine a dozen parallel ideas for supporters, initiatives which could take on the problems of racism in the game, the kind of problems John's very concerned about with, the kind of perception of masculinity, of what it is to be a young man, all those kind of things. If you've got a system which transmits information up the system, you've also got one which can devolve it down. And we need both desperately. And I hope that is one of the things that will emerge from Saturday.
Good. Jack Crawford, do you think that apart from the fact that supporters pay money to watch games and therefore they fund at the game, they're sometimes regarded as a bit of a nuisance?
I wouldn't say nuisance. I think that's a bit hard talking about nuisance. And I think there has been a lot of attention paid to the support side. But I do go along with Gordon and Rowan, obviously, that there hasn't been a close enough link between the paying customer and the man who runs the industry. I can't explain that. I know from a police point of view, it's always difficult to relate to the chap on the other side. But there is no coordination, and Gordon is quite right. Unfortunately, we are disjointed. We all work to the best we can in our own areas, but there isn't a coordination between areas quite often. There's a very good link now between supporters associations, league clubs. There's a close tie between police forces in the exchange of information. But generally it's all to do with control of the crowds and the actual safety aspect and the delays that we envisage on motorways and things sometimes doesn't get through to perhaps the right place. I think when Gordon talks about football, he talks about not just our national game, he talks about a recreation of football, and you've only got to go out on a Sunday morning and see how many kids are playing football on the park. If the national game suffers because professional football suffers, then they suffer as well, obviously, because every lad wants to play for his local team.
But you are described as a security advisor. Shouldn't you be described as safety advisor?
It may well be that my title will change to safety advisor. I always say my role in the Football League is more of a coordinator of the efforts that the clubs are doing, and a liaison between the clubs and the local authorities and the police. And it's as much on safety as it is on crowd control. In fact, probably the element is 60% on safety most times.
Right, prevention then. Roger Suddards, have we any hope in that direction? Is anything happening?
Oh yes, I think we have, because the football scene is part of a much larger scene of civil emergencies, of all the sort of emergencies and disasters we've seen over the last few years. And at the University of Bradford, 80 months ago, we set up a seminar of interested people, ranging from the uniformed services, the voluntary services, people who had been involved in disasters and so on, to see what we could do about civil emergencies generally. And from that came a recommendation to the Prime Minister that the matter should be investigated. She took it on board very firmly and appointed the Home Office, who are in the middle now, and I think probably coming to a conclusion fairly soon, of trying to get a plan together for dealing with civil emergencies. And I think you've got to divide it really into three things. First of all, it's avoidance of emergencies, which really has to have quite a lot of attention. Secondly, it's the response to an emergency, what should happen if there is an emergency. And third, the immediate help that you can get after an emergency. But to do this, you have got to have plans in place. Now, there are a lot of plans in place in all sorts of local authorities, in the police force, the fire services, for particular disasters. But what has come through to me tonight from the discussion is this need for coordination. And there is a need for coordination on a much wider scale as well, that if you have a disaster, you must bring all the forces who can help and do what they can in those circumstances together. You equally, of course, have got to have a leader. Somebody's got to take control. And it's this sort of thing which the Home Office is grappling with now. I think one of the recommendations that I'm very keen on is the availability of what I've called a hotline, which is if you have a disaster, say in the middle of Suffolk on a Sunday afternoon, you have an explosion, how do you know how to get in touch with the person who is the country's leading expert on a particular chemical?
Yeah, the point is, you mentioned the Home Office, you dropped it into the conversation there. Is the Home Office going to have the impetus? Is it getting a push now?
I think it is, and the interesting thing about that particular hotline idea is that Desmond Fennell, when he did the King's Cross inquiry, he embraced that idea and he thought it was a good one, and he's recommended it. So I think that will get a good push by the Home Office, but we're waiting for their report.
So again, in another aspect, if you like, we're talking about the Home Office, we're talking about government action. Kiva Coombs, is that going to happen?
Well, I don't know, I hope so. We need something. We can't just do nothing, obviously. We need urgent, desperate action, and that making sure what happened on Saturday could never happen again is the best memorial, the best memorial there can be. I hope the government really listens. I'll tell you this. Some people on Saturday night said to me, the people who died, they're only Scousers, they don't really care. That's got to be wrong. I hope it is wrong. We must prove it to be wrong.
Very briefly, I'll take each of you, if you will. If you were able to deliver a message to Lord Justice Taylor, can you tell me in a sentence or two sentences what that message would be? A difficult thing, Gordon Taylor?
To make football clubs safe, pleasant places, alien to the hooligan, which are focal points for community sport. Jack Crawford?
I would say to listen closely to the people who are directly involved, and that is the fans, and bring forward something that's a memorial to those people that have died.
One sentence, Roger Suddards?
I would ask him to see whether there was a plan in force for a disaster, whether it was any good, whether it was followed, and what lessons we could learn from it.
Thank you. David Oxley in Leeds.
The fans are really all that matters. No game can get by without them, so tell us what further we need to do to make sure they're totally safe and comfortable and can enjoy their sport.
Bill Kenyon.
Make football a family sport, family entertainment, and treat people like human beings.
Rogan Taylor.
Well, I'd like to see football built up again with the fans as its foundation this time.
Kiva Coombs.
Don't let us down. Find out the truth and tell it.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Don't let us down. Find out the truth and tell it loud and clear.
Will that happen?
I hope so. It'd better.
Clive Betts.
Put safety first, and we need government resources to build the grounds which the majority of fans deserve, because they are good fans who simply want to go to enjoy a game of football.
I ask you the same as I ask Kiva Coombs. Are you optimistic? Will this happen?
I think it's very important that everyone with any evidence and any feeling for football puts that evidence forward to Lord Justice Taylor and makes sure that that evidence does come out and does present the clear face of football, the good face of football, out of the recommendations.
John Williams.
How do you get a sport to modernise in a nation which is struggling with modernisation, a sport which serves communities who are falling behind this process?
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. Obviously, this is a discussion and debate that's going to continue for a very long time yet, and hopefully something will emerge from it. Well, we've heard lots of views tonight about what should happen after Hillsborough, but what do you think? From 9 o'clock, you can take part in a phone-in on your BBC local radio station in the Northwest. The number to call is 0345 056 567. That's 0345 056 567. The Roger Phillips phone-in will continue until midnight. And in the northeast, the Roni Robinson phone-in is on 0742 682 682. The number again for the northeast, that's 0742 682 682. You've heard what the panel here have said. Now is the opportunity for you to have your say. The lines there are open until 10 o'clock.
Thank you, Dick. Well, the talking about Hillsborough will inevitably go on, but the hope of everyone is that the talking will eventually lead to action. There's one thing, though, we can all do to help now. Many thousands have already given to the appeal fund set up after the disaster, but if you haven't, you can send your donation to the Hillsborough Disaster Appeal, Cooperative Bank, West Street, Sheffield, and the postal code S13SX. That's the Cooperative Bank, West Street, Sheffield, S13SX. Or Barclays Bank, Water Street, Liverpool. That's L69 2EX. That's Barclays Bank, Water Street, Liverpool, L69 2EX. Or at any bank or building society. Now, those appeal funds are likely to receive an enormous donation from the proceeds of a charity record put together in the past couple of days. Paul McCartney and Jerry Marsden brought together other pop stars to re-record Jerry's 60s hit Ferry Across the Mersey. The record will be on sale in the shops within a few weeks. But at the end of this programme, our thoughts return to Liverpool, to a community coming to terms with grief. Good night.
Life goes on day after day. Hearts torn in every way. So ferry cross the Mersey, 'cause this land's the place I love, and here I'll stay. People, they rush everywhere. Each with their own secret care. So ferry, cross the Mersey, and always take me there, the place I love. People around every corner, they seem to smile and say, we don't care what your name is, boy, we'll never turn you away. So I'll continue to say. Here I always will stay. So ferry cross the Mersey, 'cause this land's the place I love, and here I'll stay.